Leaving the ocean stream, the sun leapt up into the sky of bronze, to shine his light for gods and mortals on the fertile earth. Telemachus arrived in Pylos, where the Pelians were bringing to the beach black bulls for blue Poseidon, lord of earthquakes. So that's the first few lines of Book 3 of the Odyssey, which is the book we're going to talk about the whole of Book 3 today in Odyssey Book Club. And excitingly, very excitingly, we have now left Ithaca, finally. Telemachus is, after all that planning to kind of launch a ship to go and find news of his father, he's actually managed to do it. And he has crossed the sea and he's landed on the mainland of Greece in Pylos, which is where the great hero Nestor lives. And this whole book is going to tell us about Telemachus's trip to Pylos, his conversation with Nestor. In a sense, not much happens except for the fact that he is there talking to Nestor, and Nestor is actually going to give him some news. He's going to give him a bit of news about his father, which is what Telemachus had set out to achieve, but actually he's going to tell him a lot more about other heroes from Troy, especially what happened to Agamemnon, which we've already heard quite a lot about earlier in the poem. So we're really, really being asked to think about what happened to Agamemnon and how Agamemnon was avenged by his son Orestes. So that's all kind of important. But I suppose, okay, it's important to say that Pylos is a real place that exists now. It's if you think about the shape of Greece, with the peninsula at the bottom, the big peninsula at the bottom, and it has 3 fingers that come down out of it. Pylos is on the left-hand side of the left-hand finger, and it is a real place in a way that, even though there is an island of Ithaca, we're not exactly sure that that is the real island where anyone called Odysseus might or might not have lived.
And interestingly, for those people who are desperate to find some historical truth in the Odyssey narrative, at Pylos, there are the remains of a Bronze Age palace, and in fact, a whole lot of syllabic documents, very early Bronze Age documents have been discovered, which we will come and talk about in a later episode when we crack Linear B.
Yeah, so syllabic, that just means using a different writing system that isn't the alphabet. And King Nestor looms very large also in the Iliad, the poem that we're not talking about, but does, as we know, describe the Trojan War. And he's a character, and he's a character in both senses. So what Nestor represents in terms of all these different heroic characters who fought at Troy, he represents being the old wise geezer and having a long memory. So in the Iliad, he shows up giving people advice and also telling stories that he remembers about his youth, when heroes were much better than they are now in the present of the epics. So actually, he can be, I don't know, Mary, if this is very naughty to say, he can be a bit of a bore, because he's always saying, in my day, you call you lot heroes. No, in my day, that was when there were real heroes.
Yeah, men were men and boys were boys, and it was all better in the old days. But he's also, because he has this fantastic long memory, and because he's a decent old bloke, even if he's a bit of a bore, he is a very good first stop for Telemachus on his way to try to find out what has happened to his dad. And in a way, this is Nestor's book, because Telemachus arrives at the beginning, and at the end of it, 400 lines later, Nestor is sending the young man off to go to Sparta to talk to King Menelaus to get more information about Dad.
So there's like a key part of Telemachus's gap year evolving here, that he's off on his first stop, and also uh Nestor is it like Mary said, he's a really good guy, and his palace and his household is run beautifully. There's a lot about hospitality in the Odyssey, about how you treat a stranger. That's going to come up again and again, particularly when Odysseus is off encountering different people on his travels later in the poem. How you treat a stranger, how you welcome them, and are you sacrificing properly to the gods? How is your household run? These are really big questions, and what we get here, actually, if I'm not wrong, for the first time in the poem, we're getting a well-regulated household where everything is running smoothly and properly. And so Telemachus, who with the goddess Athena disguised as Mentor, are welcomed very lavishly. And there's this whole, what I love, and this comes up again and again in the Odyssey as well. When you're being properly welcomed by a proper host, they don't ask you any questions until after you've been given a very nice meal. And then you're asked something like, what do you want? Why are you here? But first you're given a lovely feast.
I think you're absolutely right in the architecture of the poem, Charlotte, because we've just come from Ithaca, where even if occasionally Telemachus manages to treat a visitor right, basically is in disarray, that hospitality is being abused, it's a house in disorder. And so we leave that in book 2. And in book 3, we come into a house that is properly run and welcoming. And poor old Telemachus, he still is. He still is growing up, and he gets in a bit of a paddy about what he's going to say to Nestor, because there's this very old wise guy, and he's thinking, oh, what on earth do I say to him, right? Suddenly chips are down, and Athena, in the disguise of Mentor, has to say, oh, for heaven's sake, go on and do it. You're old enough to do this now. Just speak to him.
Not for the first time, Athena is having to issue spine-stiffening kind of pep talks to Telemachus. But one of the hilarious things about this book, and I do think it is quite funny almost, is that how weird it is that Athena is on this trip with Telemachus, when actually some of the conversation is actually about Athena and what Athena did at Troy and how Athena turned against the Greeks at Troy. But she's right there, okay? I'm right here. Luckily, no one says anything bad about her.
No, it's kind of wonderful, because it has to be intentional irony, that here we've got Athena, she's overhearing and keeping a bit of a straight face while they talk about her and how she behaved at Troy. And when she fetches up at the beginning, they make her say a prayer to Poseidon, because they're having a big sacrifice. We'll come onto this in a bit. They're having a big religious sacrifice to the god Poseidon. Athena's given the job of praying to a rival god, in a way. So we're constantly kind of thinking, is Athena going to out herself? And she only does that towards the end, when she flies off as a vulture, and that kind of clinches it, that she wasn't really just Mentor.
She can't help. I love it. Like at the end, in Emily Wilson's translation, it's an ossifrage. She flies off disguised as an ossifrage, which, my friends, is a kind of vulture. Despite being quite keen on bird watching myself, I did actually have to look that up. Anyway, it's a kind of vulture. So she can't help going, oh guys, by the way, I am a god all along.
Yeah, and it's wonderful, isn't it? When Nestor is saying, look, Telemachus, you've got to spend a night here. You can't go back to the ship, because how could I have my honored guests camping out on their ship when they could have the true hospitality of Nestor's palace at Pylos? And this suits Telemachus down to the ground, but Athena says, no, I think I'll go. I think fine for me. There's all the lads on the ship, and I'm the only old person, so I will go back and take care of them, and then off I'm sorry, I'm going to say it's a vulture, not an ossifrage. I've never heard of. Off she goes.
There's a brilliant bit also where Nestor is saying, Athena, used to really love your dad, Telemachus. She really looked out for him, she was always I've never seen a god be so good to a man as Athena was to your dad. I'm sure she's on your side somewhere, and Telemachus is a bit sort of iffy about this. I don't know. I don't know. And and then Athena, disguised as mentor, actually speaks up and says, "What are you talking about, Telemachus? Of course, a god can easily save anyone. Even if they're miles and miles away." Um, and then she turns the conversation back to this Agamemnon story again.
Because I think one of the things that is so important about the beginning of the Odyssey, and it's a bit unexpected actually, is that one of the main themes is what happened to the other people who, from the Greek force, who are trying to get back home after their victory against the mythical city of Troy, or the real city of Troy, depending on your view. Um, and here we have a bit of a litany of them about, how, well, Achilles was actually buried at Troy, and so was Patroclus, etc. Other people got away. But the key comparison between Odysseus and the others is always focused on what happened to the leader of the forces, King Agamemnon, who went back home to Argos and was murdered because his wife Clytemnestra, not without certain provocation, it has to be said, because Agamemnon has sacrificed their daughter to the gods, killed her, in other words. But Clytemnestra has not been a faithful Penelope, but she has entered an adulterous relationship with a man called Aegisthus. And the comparison's always being drawn in the beginning of the Odyssey between Agamemnon's return and Odysseus's return, which we don't actually know about yet. And in fact, we've still lost him here, but to some extent we're being told, sometimes explicitly, that anything is better than the return of Agamemnon, who returns to an adulterous wife and is murdered by Aegisthus and the wife. Interestingly, in the main feed, we looked at Aeschylus's version of the story of the return of Agamemnon, a drama of the mid-5th century, and in that drama, composed later than this, the person who kills Agamemnon when he gets back is explicitly said to be Clytemnestra. In Homer, Clytemnestra is kind of not a baddie in that way. And the real villain here is Aegisthus, the lover who murders Agamemnon.
That's in our Cassandra episode, if you want to go and look at that one. I mean, I think it's terribly interesting that we hear almost nothing about actual Odysseus. Nestor is telling Telemachus what he does know, which is other people. It's Agamemnon, and also he knows about Menelaus. And in fact, in a sense, where this book is going is telling us about Agamemnon, but also saying to Telemachus, no, you need to carry on your journey. You need to go over to Sparta, because Menelaus is back. He's in Sparta, and he may well know more about your father. But we shouldn't ignore, there's so much information pointedly being given to Telemachus about Agamemnon, and it's all about, for Telemachus, it's kind of about, are you the kind of son who will avenge the killing of your father? Are you like Orestes? Because Orestes is discussed. And I suppose in a sense, there's a right way and a wrong way to return home. And if you return in the way that Agamemnon did, with a wife who has betrayed you for perhaps very good reason, things are going to go badly. And so there are all sorts of questions being asked about what kind of wife Odysseus might have, what kind of return he might be thinking about, because Agamemnon returns in pomp and openly, and as we discover later in the poem, Odysseus is going to do something very different from that.
But there's a kind of 2-generational comparison going on here. because you've got the fathers, Odysseus and Agamemnon, their return to Greece is being compared. But then there's the comparison between the sons of what kind of son, as you say, Telemachus is going to turn out to be, because the son of Agamemnon, Orestes, takes vengeance on the murderers of his father. And the question we're left with is, how is Telemachus going to defend the honor or take vengeance for or treat his dad? So Orestes has by now killed Clytemnestra, his mother, and her lover, Odysseus. What's Telemachus going to do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Mary, one thing that we really want to talk about this session, partly because it does take up quite a lot of space in this book, is about all this feasting, but specifically about all the sacrificing that happens. Because this goes, I admitted to you at some point that my eye tends to slide a little over the long scenes in the Odyssey about sacrificing to the gods, just because it's kind of like nothing is really happening here. We are just somehow having an ancient sacrifice described to us in incredible detail. The story isn't moving on. But am I being a bit naughty? Tell us why the sacrifice scenes are interesting and important.
You're missing a lot. I confess too that there have been times when I've skipped over the sacrifice scenes. I'll come clean. But if you want to understand ancient Greek culture, not just religious culture, but partly religious culture, you have to understand the central ritual of killing and sacrificing an animal to the gods. It way outlasts Homer. I mean, these are some of the most detailed descriptions, actually literal descriptions of what happens at a sacrifice that we have from ancient Greece. But there is no moment in pagan Greece or pagan Rome when the slaughter of an animal as a gift to the gods was not absolutely central. Now, it doesn't have to be done by a priest. It can be done at home. And it essentially, although this is on a very grand scale in Book 3, it is being done at home and conducted by Nestor. I think we have a rather limited view of what sacrifice is. I mean, we think of it partly rightly as taking some poor animal up to the altar, slitting its throat, and saying that's done in honor of the gods. And we think, oh, right, that's a bit brutal, and we feel a bit sorry for the poor lamb that we might see pictured being sacrificed. It is much more embedded in the day-to-day world of how you do things and what the community is. Now, sometimes, as here, it's much, much bigger. The first sacrifice we see, which is sacrifice being made to Poseidon, there's loads of animals. So we're not just taking one poor sheep. This is loads of big animals being killed. But I think that what we miss when we just think of it as the killing of the animal is it's the eating of the animal. This is about not just the killing and offering of the animal. This is about consumption. And it's about a very, very regulated form of consumption. Because throughout Greek culture, and it goes on to Rome too, throughout Greek culture, the gods get given different parts of the animal from humans. The animal is killed. The thigh bones, and it's described in Book 3 here. The thigh bones are extracted. They're covered with the glistening, shiny fat from the body of the animal. That is then lit, and the savour of it, the smell and the odour, goes up for the gods in heaven. Meanwhile, what we would say is the really good bits of the animal, the meat, that is reserved for the human beings who are conducting the sacrifice, And they always sit down to a jolly good feast on the meat after the sacrifice itself has taken place. And that is as important, really, as the lighting the thigh bones and the fat for the gods, because this is about a ritual which brings the community together to eat together. Now, there's all kinds of problems about that. Greeks themselves asked, why do the gods get the rubbish bits? Why do the gods get palmed off with the thigh bones and the fat? And one answer to that was that actually there'd been a very good trick that mortals had long ago played on the gods, which said, okay, gods, you get this, you get the fat, and we'll have the flesh. Others said, no, but gods can't really eat meat. They can only sniff the aroma. So the gods got the bit they wanted, and the humans got the bit that they wanted. And this might be, it's a bit disputed, but there's some people who think that sacrifice was the only occasion that ancient Greeks actually sat down to meat, right? And that even in Rome, some people would argue that the meat that ends up in the butcher's market had all started out as sacrificial offerings. I'm not certain about that, but it is absolutely clear that eating together as a community is fundamental to the idea of sacrifice. And it's just like you say, Charlotte, you said, here we've come to a society working properly. And what's the first thing we see about that society working properly?
Yeah, they're making a sacrifice, and then
Yeah.
they're going to have a lovely feast of meat. And in this poem, indeed, also in the Iliad, there is a tiny exception where Odysseus, I think, is forced to do some fishing because he has to eat some fish because he's going to starve otherwise. But people only ever eat meat. These heroes only ever eat meat, which must be kind of, it makes no sense. It makes no logical sense that these humans of, okay, a mythical past that's somehow based in some memory of the Bronze Age are only eating meat. That is not your Mediterranean diet. There's a lot of fruit. There's a lot of ability to make cheese from lovely goats and things like that. There is a lot of fish. There's a lot of fish. So, the idea that these guys are always eating meat, I think in terms of the poem, is much more about these guys were strong, heroic, and lived a long time ago. And it's a kind of part of the package of being a Homeric hero is this sort of constant diet of meat. Which
Which always comes with sacrifice,
Yeah.
and it actually cites the Homeric hero. And in this book, sacrifice bookends the book.
Yeah.
They arrive, what's happening is a sacrifice, and then once Nestor has realized that there's more to mentor than meets the eye, they have another sacrifice at the end. And so that really, really does put in your face the idea that sacrifice is what defines the well-ordered community. And particularly the sacrifice towards the end of the book, which describes in detail how they treat the animal and how they gild the heifer's horns. That is really one of the most precise descriptions of what you do with an animal at sacrifice that we've got from anywhere in antiquity.
We should say that, of course, sacrifice is the central thing you do to show your respect to the gods. So it is absolutely central to being a good person who is living in harmony with doing the right thing by the gods. You forget to sacrifice to the gods at your peril, and there can be very serious consequences for people in the poems of Homer if you forget to do it. So here we are, Nestor doing it, the feasting, the hospitality, the being kind to the guests, the sacrifice, the respect to the gods, all of that is sort of part of one thing of being this well-regulated, proper community and polity.
Some historians of Greek religion would go so far as to say that the ritual of sacrifice kind of embedded a version of correct cosmological ordering. There's a hierarchy of living creatures here. We have the gods as the superhuman living creatures who receive the savor at the top. There are the human beings who sacrifice to the gods but eat the meat. And at the bottom of this literal food chain, we've got the animals who are sacrificed to the gods. And that, as it were, symbolizes and kind of embodies the hierarchy of the living creatures in the world cosmologically.
Ha! As a
Ha.
vegetarian, I fully disapprove of this. But there we are.
But
Another
one thing,
example of us being super different from these.
one thing that makes very interesting, though, I mean, it's good you raised vegetarianism, Charlotte, because what that means is that in antiquity, there is no option for being a vegetarian.
What about your pie? Oh.
Wait a minute. Unless that goes with a rejection
Yeah.
of the whole worldview that sacrifice offers you. So, of course, there are some well-known vegetarian sects like the Pythagoreans.
That's what I was going to say. My over eager, too clever way. I was like, what about the Pythagoreans, Mary? They were vegetarians, but they, like you say, they rejected the sort of central tenets of that what you were supposed to do about the Olympian gods. They had a different, a sort of very different belief system.
The point is, I think vegetarianism in antiquity is not a choice. You can't think, vegetarianism goes along with the rejection of how most people think the world works. So it's a very big deal. Very big deal indeed.
But back to Pylos and to the story. I mean, I think we should think about drawing it to a close. I mean, next stop is Sparta, which I'm super excited about because it's one of my favorite parts of the Odyssey. So please join us next time. But I want to ask you about Nestor's cup, Mary, because there is an actual archaeological object known as Nestor's cup that is in a sweet little museum on the island of Ischia, just off the coast of Italy near Naples. And tell me, like, is Nestor's cup? Did it belong to Nestor by any chance?
It's called Nestor's cup, and I think it probably had absolutely nothing to do with anybody who might or might not have been Nestor. It's a ceramic vessel of the second half of the 8th century BC, just about the time when writing was being invented. This is a cup inscribed in Greek, but found in the Greek settlement of Pithecusae, which is an island off the coast of Italy. And it's a ceramic cup, and it says, literally, I am Nestor's cup, and I hope you have a great time if you drink out of me, or whatever.
That's so nice.
Which is just amazing. Now, what's interesting is that in Nestor's appearance in the Iliad, he does appear with a very precious gold cup, which is kind of almost his trademark. So it's not clear whether this is actually a kind of joke, that here's this ceramic version and some wit has written on it, this is Nestor's cup, right? When it's not Nestor's cup at all, because Nestor's cup in the Iliad is really grand and gold. It does, this little object, this Nestor's cup object, does have some kind of knock-on consequences for when we think the Odyssey and the Iliad became part of common currency, because the Nestor's cup at Pithecusae it's very early. It's 8th century BC, probably the second half. If it is that, it's either inscribed just at the moment that the Iliad and the Odyssey are being written down, or some people think even before they are, suggesting that it's a reflection not of a written text of Homer, but it's a reflection of some of those stories in the oral tradition of Homer, which are, in the popular currency, and then here turned into writing actually in Italy. So it's always a surprise, I think, to realize that this is one of the first, possibly not the first, but one of the first surviving bits of Greek writing that we have, and it's not found in Greece at all. It's found in a Greek settlement off the coast of Italy. But it commemorates dear old Nestor, and it makes you think of his great hospitality and the way he looked after Telemachus pretty well.
Well, let us leave our friends, our characters, sleeping soundly on the lovely sheepskin blanket in Nestor's palace, and we will see you next time in Sparta.
If you've got any thoughts, if you've got any ideas, anything you'd like us to do, contact us on instantclassicspod, all one word, at gmail.com.
Or on our social media at Instant Classics Pod.
Instant Classics Book Club will be back soon. And in the meantime, head to the main feed for more from Instant Classics.
See you next time.